Today, we're going to look at the layers of the skin. Right now, you have in front of you a blank sheet that kind of looks like this. In general, you need to be familiar with a few things about each layer of the skin. Be sure to fill in your notes as you go, or watch this video a few times to make sure you get all of the information that you need. First, we're going to look at the epidermis. The epidermis has a few things you need to be familiar with, including the functions and locations of all the cell types, the layers of the epidermis, and you need to know the functions, the special qualities, the order of the layers, and what each of these layers looks like in the epidermis. In general, the epidermis's function is to protect us, whether that is from keratinization or hardness of the skin due to a protein called keratin, or through certain cells that allow us to touch, protect us from the sun, or from biological harm. The epidermis's sole function is to protect us. The epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue. It does not have a direct blood supply, which causes the cells to die as they get closer to the surface of the skin and eventually slough off. We will talk about the certain layers of the skin that get nutrients, oxygen, and blood through diffusion of the dermis. Let's start off with looking at the top layer, the stratum corneum. The stratum corneum is basically a ton of squished keratinized cells together that creates a waterproof barrier. It is so many rows of flat, dead keratinocytes. Here is a close-up diagram of what the stratum corneum looks like. Next, we have the stratum lucidum. There's an asterisk next to this layer because it's actually an extra layer of skin that's only found in thick skin on the body, so mostly on the soles of our hands and feet. This layer is the reason why calluses form. Calluses are a buildup of this translucent layer of skin. The next layer in the epidermis is the stratum granulosum. As you saw, I drew tiny little dots in this layer. The little tiny dots of the stratum granulosum's keratinocytes is because of the granules that form from keratin and the organelles dying off in this layer. This layer does not receive any nutrients directly, which is why the cells begin to die off. In this photo, it's zoomed in on the stratum granulosum. The little purple dots are the granules in this layer. The next layer is the stratum spinosum, named for its spiny keratin filaments that arise in this layer. This is the last layer that is able to divide because it is the last layer to get nutrients through the dermis through diffusion. In this photo, the white kind of hairy looking area are the keratin filaments that are starting to form in the stratum spinosum. The last layer of the epidermis, which is closest to the dermis, is the basal layer, or the stratum basale. In this layer, the cells are fully mitotic, which means they're continually dividing. The cells can get the most nutrients from the dermis here, so they are just continually dividing and eventually moving upwards towards the surface of the epidermis. In this layer, we also find other cell types. Starting with letter A, we have melanocytes. Melanocytes are specialized cells that protect us from UV radiation. You may have heard of the term melanin before. Melanin is a pigment that melanocytes release to darken us to protect us from UV radiation. Letter B is pointing to a Merkel cell. These are spiny-looking cells that help us sense light touch. The last cell type we have yet to talk about is Langerhans cells. These are macrophages with long arms that meander around the spinosum and basale layer to protect us from pathogens and engulf them. The reason why we see so many cell types deep in the epidermis is because all of these cells need blood for nutrients and oxygen, which is diffused from the dermal layer. One last cell type that I wanted to reiterate is the keratinocyte. Keratinocytes are the cells that make up the majority of our epidermis. These are the cells that we've been drawing the most so far. The main job of keratinocytes is to produce keratin, which is a protein that keeps our skin hard and durable. As mentioned before, all that we've been talking about are layers of the epidermis. The epidermis, to reiterate, is made up of epithelial tissue and does not have a direct blood supply. This is why if you scrape your arm or your leg, you sometimes do not bleed. The only way that you would bleed if you scrape your arm or leg is if it directly reaches the dermal layer. One way to remember the order of the layers of the epidermis is saying the phrase, "Come on, let's get sunburned." Here is what the layers of the epidermis looks like underneath a microscope. The next layer of the skin is the dermis. The dermis is actually made up of two distinct layers, which I am going to draw in. First, the top layer is made up of areolar connective tissue. The bottom, larger layer of the dermis is made up of reticular connective tissue. The dermis does have a direct blood supply. This is where you will find blood vessels as well as nerve endings, many different types of cells to protect us from pathogens, hair follicles, oil cells, as well as sweat glands. In the more superficial layer of the dermis, otherwise known as the papillary layer, we have what's called dermal papillae. Dermal papillae are projections of the dermis into the epidermis. This is what makes our fingerprints. Fingerprints allow us to sense light pressure. The bottom, or reticular layer, which is made up of dense, irregular connective tissue, is where we find all of our blood supply. This part of the dermis is also what makes our skin very elastic, since this type of connective tissue has a lot of collagen and elastic fibers. We also have all of our sweat and oil glands that start in this layer of the skin and project upwards into the epidermis. The most deep layer of skin is the hypodermis. Hypo means underneath, if you remember. The reason why I am drawing a lot of circles in this layer is because it is made up of adipose connective tissue. If you remember, this type of connective tissue looks a lot like bubbles. In general, this layer is not necessarily considered a layer of skin, but sits underneath it. It serves as a shock absorber and insulator, as well as helps anchor our skin to the rest of our body. I wanted to mention again the elastic and collagen fibers in our dermal layer. These fibers are actually the source of wrinkles in later years. When the collagen and elastic fibers begin to degrade, the skin becomes less elastic and the folds in the skin are more visible. This is why younger people have more snapback in their skin as compared to older people. And this is why some people try to get collagen injections to try to heal their collagen if they have wrinkles. Some ways that people try to get rid of their wrinkles is with Botox, but Botox works in a way that you probably don't realize. Botox injections are actually a bacteria that paralyzes the muscles in the face, stretching the skin more so wrinkles are less likely to be seen. Botox actually does not do anything to affect the fibers that are no longer working properly. It just paralyzes the muscles, which is why sometimes people with Botox have a hard time moving their face around or making emotional expressions. Thank you for taking time to watch this video and filling in the layers of your skin. Please be sure to fill in your notes and write down any questions you may have that we can address in class together. We are going to take some time to go over all of these layers in class again. Just make sure that you try to fill in your notes the best that you can now.